This is, as you probably gathered, I think it's written on the front of your top of your bulletins, that this is Reign of Christ Sunday, it says here, also known as Christ the King Sunday. I'm going to call it that now because the word king shows up in the passage that I read to you, and the word reign never does. But it's the same day. On the Christian calendar every year we do that. We don't, as Protestants, do an awful lot with that. Some of you ex-Catholics may recognize a much stronger Christ the King liturgy than what we have here. What we did do is we put it in the bulletin. And the hymns kind of reflect that. Crown him with many crowns, a little bit of Christ the Kingness in that. And the two scriptures that we read to you have a king theme to them in one way or another. And the one in the New Testament that I read a moment ago, there's not much, but there is that piece where Jesus is on the cross and they're calling him the King of the Jews. His deriders down below are doing that. And the one that Chris read a moment ago, it's about the crowning or the ordaining, the anointing of the very, very first king that Israel ever had. And that's the one I want to spend most of my time on, but I'm going to talk about both of them eventually. The one in the Old Testament takes a lot more times to give you what's going on there before we ever get around to the point. So hold on for a second, okay? Got a little background here, and I mean a background that goes way, way back, starting back with Moses, freeing the Hebrew people out of slavery from Egypt, brings us to this point of this passage today. Because when Moses did that, you know the story. Moses freed the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt, and they went across the wilderness, and then finally they landed at the edge of the Promised Land, and Moses passed away, and Joshua took them the rest of the way, and Joshua fit the Battle of Jericho, as you may from your childhood. And then they finally got in, they settled, and there's some battles back and forth, but they finally became the people of Israel in the Promised Land. The Promised Land, that was euphemistically called the land of milk and honey, which is rock and gravel and sand and dust and mountains, but that's what they call the land of milk and honey. But I guess if you've been a slave in Egypt for 200 years, even the desert would still seem pretty honey-ish. Now, one thing you may not have known, this is very interesting. Egypt, of course, held all of the Hebrew people as slaves, right? But the land that they went to was also owned by Egypt, and those poor peasants who were the farmers there were put down strongly by Egypt where they felt like they were slaves too. Both groups had the same master. So one of the reasons why the battle to get into the Promised Land, which later on became known as Palestine, one of the reasons why that was so easy to get into, it wasn't terribly easy, but a little bit easier to get into, is scholars believe that when the Hebrews got there, they found people like them. And the people who were there thought that the Hebrews were like them. Hey, slaves under Egypt, you're like us. And they bonded together. And they married, and they became families, and they blended a whole lot more easily. And when the battles were taking place, all the peasants rose up and joined the Hebrews in the fight. So it was an interesting kind of a compatible thing that was rejoicing for everyone. Well, sort of. It wasn't very rejoicing to the Egyptians. They weren't pleased about that at all. So what the Egyptians finally did, some time passed, the Egyptians, what they did is they hired some mercenaries. And they didn't even know their name. In all of the Egyptian literature about this, they just called these mercenaries the sea people, these strange people who came from islands over in the Aegean Sea somewhere. They paid them. Actually, they'd beaten them in battle, so they paid them by letting them go free too. If they would go over and settle on the west bank of Israel, what later became known as Israel, settle in that area and start running terrorist campaigns into the towns and villages of Israel. Did you know that? And I mean terrorist campaigns. They did some battles, but they had a lot of times they would just send somebody in there with a sword. And by the way, they had all the swords, and Israel didn't have very many. They would stick a sword in somebody's pants, run into a market somewhere, pull the swords out, and start slashing and killing everybody. And of course, they'd die. They'd eventually be chopped down themselves. But meanwhile, they killed 15 people, and the entire town was terrified. They had, honest to goodness, suicide terrorist attacks back in the days of early Israel. And it scared the spit out of them. People were horrified by this, and they didn't know exactly what to do. So they ran over and fought them, right? And they lost 3,000 people because the sea people had all these swords and the Israelis did not. How would you feel if someone came into your shores and suddenly did terrorist attacks and killed 3,000 people? Actually, I think we do know what we would do on that, don't we? It was terrifying. It was scary. And they didn't know what to do about that. One thing I will say, which is kind of funny, I'll say this in passing, has nothing to do nothing to do with the point of the story. Well, one of the times when the sea people came in, they rushed over to Shechem, where they were keeping the Ark of the Covenant. Remember, the Ark is the thing that Moses carried all across the desert and finally put it in the Holy of Holies when they got there and settled there. It was in Shechem. So the sea people ran in, grabbed the Ark of the Covenant, and ran back out again and took it over to their town. I think they took it to Gad, but I'm not sure exactly. And that's where they kept it. However, the entire military battalion broke out with diarrhea. I'm not making that up. In fact, if you read the Bible's version of it, it's worse than what I just said. It was really, really gross. And so they took the ark and said, let's take this back. And they returned and said, maybe God did this to us for stealing the Holy of Holies. And so they took it back. In fact, they even paid the Israelites to take it back from them. So it was, now that didn't change the war, but it was a kind of funny little thing that happened in the middle of one of the battles. Keep that in mind in case you ever steal anything. You never know what's going to happen to you. But the people overall were stricken by numerous attacks they didn't understand, from a people they didn't understand, with a religion they didn't understand, and a language they didn't understand, and the attacks went on and on. So that brings us to today's passage, the one that Chris just read to you. So they came up to Samuel. Now let me explain Samuel. The Hebrew people, when they settled in Palestine, they didn't set up a kingship at all. They didn't have kings. What they had instead was judges. Remember the book in the Old Testament called the Book of Judges? That's a listing of all these people who had been judges during that time. And these judges were kind of democratically elected. Now, I don't want to call it a real full-blown democracy. They didn't have ballots and they didn't have campaigns. They didn't have wealthy people giving money to re-election campaigns. They didn't have anything like that. But every time they needed somebody to be a leader, they would kind of get together and campaign and see who's going to be the best person, who's the biggest and the strongest, who's had the most experience and those kinds of things, who's the best skilled person. And they would debate it back and forth, and they would choose old John or Larry, and that person would be risen up. Now, they always said that we chose this person because God had put God's hand on this person in advance, and I'm sure that's true. On the other hand, they all voted, and they all campaigned, and they all argued about it, and finally chose this one, and he would be the one. It was a crazy system. They had 12 tribes, as you know. It's a loose confederation of all these tribes. By the way, the 12 disciples are based on the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes out there, and they were kind of loosely put together. And every time they needed anybody, they had kind of a little mini election and chose someone. And it could be anybody. They didn't have the divine right of kings, none of that business. So they just picked anybody who looked like they could do the job. As a matter of fact, this is crazy. This is just crazy. At least once, maybe twice in their history, they actually chose a woman to be their national leader. This is 3,000 years ago. That is bizarre today. They never, ever got another woman leader until Golda Meir in 1950. Thousands of years later. It's just an amazing thing. Her name's Deborah. Go look her up. She was great. It was probably the closest thing to an egalitarian, equal, just, fair, almost democratic kind of a society anywhere in the ancient Near East, maybe even in the entire world, maybe anywhere. It was great. And then it ended with this passage. It ended. These people terrified, scared, at their wits' end. They went to Samuel. Samuel was the last of the judges. They came to Samuel and said, "You're getting old, and we don't like your kids." Go figure. And then they said, "We want to have a king now instead of a judge." And Samuel said, "Don't you understand? A king would be terrible." And they said, "We don't care. We want to feel safe." So Samuel went off to God and talked it over, and God said, "Well, listen, if that's what they want, then give it to them." And he said an interesting thing. He said, "Samuel, they're not doing this because of you, your leadership. That's not the point. They're doing this to me," God is speaking. They're doing this because way back when I first liberated them from slavery in Egypt, ever since then, They have not wanted to worship me. They have wanted to worship a person or worship an idol or worship a thing. So it's not you that they're denying. They're denying me, God. So Samuel, he said, one thing, when you go back to them, tell them all the bad things that a king would do. But if they want to do it. So you heard the list a while ago. It went on and on and on. Actually, Chris, I almost chopped that list down for you because it was too long. But it is telling, at least, on some of the awful things that a king could do if a king was going to rule a nation. Some of them were that the king would conscript all of the young adults in the families and take them off and declare war on their neighbors somewhere and enslave them to do that. It's possible. And then it costs a lot of money, so it's going to raise all the taxes on everything, on your grain, on your wheat, on your flours, on your oil, all that stuff. Going to raise all the taxes. You'll be impoverished. They're going to take all of your women. They're going to work for the king. You're going to be this building program going to go on forever. He went the long list. I've forgotten some of those. And at the end of the day, you've got a king who's going to keep you safe. Well, good enough for you. So he went back to them and he told them all that. And they said, we don't care. We want to feel safe. We don't care about freedom. We don't care about a livelihood. We are frightened and we want to feel safe. So he goes back to God one more time and God says, pfft. That's not quite exactly what he said, but it's kind of like that. Okay, go back and do it. And the last line, as you know, says that they went and they got Saul and had Saul declared as their first king. Now, the story doesn't end there, and I'm not going to go and read it all because it goes on for several chapters, but right after that they got Saul, and Saul, as you probably know, was pretty psychotic. He was a manic depressive. He had these stories about sometimes he would break out and take all of his clothes off and run through the streets naked, screaming at the top of his lungs. One time he did that for 40 miles, I think it is, running alongside his chariot, also naked. I'm not sure why that is. Another time he's found just quivering in the sand. And other times he'd fall in these deep, deep depressions and wouldn't get out of bed for 3 or 4 days. As a matter of fact, the way he met, who later on became David, King David, the way he met David is that some of his courtiers there brought David in, because David is a musician. He could sing and play an instrument and try to pull him out of the funk. It didn't work. But Saul was sick. And he finally died, probably committed suicide, actually. Later, David took over. That's a long story about how he became a king. And David was a good king in some ways. I won't go into his sexual problems, but they were numerous and frequent, and they went on all of his life. And then he also conquered this country and conquered that country and conquered this country and conquered that country. So the country was way overextended trying to hold all these holdings together. And then he died. And then Solomon came in. You remember Solomon. We always think of Solomon as this great leader because he was so wise. The wisdom of Solomon, all the Song of Solomon. He didn't write that stuff. Somebody else did. Solomon was a brutal dictator. He was cruel. It actually says in the Bible that he enslaved 30,000 of his own people. Partly to work for him, partly to build these huge edifices that he was building, a palace, a home, a temple. He went on and on and on and on. And then he did enslave the women as well. He enslaved everybody, and then he conquered other things, and he lived off the fat of the land, and his people were starving. And he would exacerbate all of the tensions that was going on. The country was dividing. It was fighting among itself underneath it. And he would pit this group against that group, and it got worse and worse and worse. And finally, when Solomon died, all of that burning anger under the surface exploded, and they started a civil war, and the country just melted down. The South seceded from the Union, and they became 2 nations. One of them in the north was called Israel, and the other one in the south is called Judah. By the way, that's why they're called Jews. Those who lived in Judah were called Jews. Split in half. Terrible. And then the north got in a fight with Assyria, and they lost, and they wiped the entire population out and sent them all over the world, and nobody knows where they are today. Ever heard of the wandering Jews? It's related to the wandering people that got dispersed during that war. Then Babylonia got in a fight with them, and you remember the Babylonian captivity when all the people of Israel were taken over to Babylon. Fortunately, in that case, though, Babylon got beaten in its own war, so all those people would come back later on. Otherwise, there wouldn't be anything. So that's the story. I'm going to move on to the New Testament now, but I want to say, if there's any moral in all of this ugliness, I think the moral is that when you get frightened, you make bad decisions. Don't do that. When you get scared, sometimes you go for security rather than goodness. And try not to do that, because you almost always make a bad decision when you're making it out of fear. New Testament passage ties into this in a very interesting kind of way. You think there's not much there. It's just this little story. It's not even very long. It's a story of the dialogue that took place when Jesus was on the cross. And the only reason it's here is because one of his detractors down below him put an offering on wine and said, "If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself." So they called him a king. And on his crown there was that thing that said he was the king of the Jews. And one of the people later on, who was crucified next to him, called where they would be going later Jesus' kingdom. But it's still pretty telling. Our king, instead of the one that is based on fear and might and abuse and harm, our king is one that actually was crucified on the cross. You don't see that anywhere. Our king not only was crucified, but actually looked down at all the detractors who put him on the cross and forgave them. And he forgave the other guy next to him at the same time. And our king took the other one on the other side who confessed at the last minute and brought him into paradise along with him. That's not the kind of king that you read about in the Old Testament, or frankly anywhere, even today. This is King Jesus. I want to say an interesting thing here about fear. I was reading the other day, and someone had actually done a study of the use of the word fear in the Bible. And he found, first of all, that there was, in the Gospels, there were 125 times that Jesus gives what they call an imperative statement, a directive, which is to say something like, "You must go do this." 125 of those in the Gospels. You got that? I have no idea why somebody looks that up. Can you imagine someone sitting there with a calculator and reading the Bible, and finally coming across them and listening to them all? Someone did that, though. Found 125 of them. And of those, I was very surprised to learn, of those, the most frequent directive, the most frequent imperative statement of Jesus in all of those 125 was some variation on the words, "Fear not," or "Be not afraid," or "Have courage." Isn't that interesting? Now, you won't be surprised to learn that the second most frequent one was about loving your neighbor, loving God, those kind of things. Love others in some way. That was the second most. But the number one was, don't be scared. Don't be frightened. Don't be terrified. The message of that is we don't have to be afraid. The last words of Jesus were, "Be not afraid, for lo, I am with you even unto the ends of the earth." We don't have to be afraid. No matter what happens to me, or to you, who I seldom turn around and look at, because Peter's always pretty good about turning around and look at you guys. I always forget. Whatever happens to you, or the town, or the state, or the nation, or the world, whatever happens, and sometimes it's going to be ugly, we don't have to be afraid, because we are a part of a reality that is larger than all of this. We are a part of what Jesus here calls paradise. We're a part of the kingdom of God, the realm of heaven. And no matter what happens to you, no matter where it happens or how it happens, you don't have to be afraid, because God really is with us now and forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Amen.